Hi folks, welcome back to the channel. My name is Drew. I'm an accredited exercise physiologist and Chinese medicine practitioner. And in this video, we're looking at breathing mechanics or breathwork mechanics, and particularly how we use your muscles, your breathing muscles, your respiratory muscles to change the shape of the thorax to increase volume so you can get more air into the lungs. So essentially, what's happening is when you're sitting at rest, you're breathing in about 500 mils of air per breath. And with training and with practice, you can increase that volume from 500 mils up to 5 to 6 liters, depending on how big you are. So that's a big change in breathing. Now, the more air you can get into the lungs, the more opportunity it has for diffusion, or what is really extraction of the oxygen molecules from the air in the lungs via the alveoli across the respiratory membrane into the blood, where then the oxygen gets bound to hemoglobin, and then like a little Uber, it then gets transported around the circulatory system to the working tissues and cells which require oxygen for energy. So the bigger and deeper breath you can get into your lungs, the more potential oxygen you can kind of absorb into the system, which potentially means you can get more energy production or more ATP. So when we're teaching breath work to people, one of the first things we need to do is help them find a bigger, deeper, fuller breath. And to do that, we kind of need to understand how breathing mechanics works. So the first stage is getting the air into your lungs. And one of the key things you need to do is get the air in through the nose, down the nasal passage, into the pharynx, down through the trachea, and then goes into the lungs. So we'll talk about that more in more detail because there's some issues there that we need to be aware of. But assuming we can get the air through the airway into the lungs, okay, one principle happens is with gas exchange, air moves from states of high pressure into low pressure. So when you're sitting here at rest at sea level, the pressure in the lungs on the exhalation phase is lower than the external atmospheric pressure, so the pressure outside the body. So then the air just gets naturally drawn in because it moves from high pressure to low pressure. So what happens here is, okay, as you breathe in, the diaphragm is going to pull this down. That's going to increase the shape of the thoracic cage. Okay. That's going to decrease the actual internal pressure in the lungs, because when you close the volume of a container with a gas in it, it increases the pressure. But when the same amount of gas is in that volume, but you make the pressure, the shape of the container bigger, it decreases the pressure. So what we're doing here is we're decreasing the pressure in the lungs. And so that's going to then draw in the air into the lungs just via that kind of pressure gradient exchange. So the muscle here, the diaphragm, is the key muscle that's doing this. And then as you exhale and you relax on the exhalation phase, the diaphragm will dome back up. The rib cage will depress back down again. And that changes the shape of the ribs or the thorax, which then decreases the shape in the lungs. So that creates more pressure in the lungs than the outside pressure. And so then the air is going to then be actually just naturally forced back out. So in that way, the exhalation phase can be passive, as in all you're doing is relaxing the diaphragm, which is the primary respiratory muscle. And then just by that relaxation, the ribs are going to change their shape. And that's going to decrease the pressure within the lungs, and the air is just going to be naturally pushed out. So as you breathe in, you increase the space, increase the volume. That decreases the atmospheric or the pressure internally in the lung tissue. Okay, that draws more air into the lungs. As you exhale, okay, diaphragm domes back up. Okay, changes the shape of the rib cage, decreases the volume, increases the internal pressure, and that pushes the air out again. So that's the basic kind of mechanics, or one of the key principles in breathing is changing the partial pressure in the lung itself. So the more that you can get in, more air you can breathe in, okay, the more opportunity you have for diffusion. So that's where the gas molecules move from the lungs into the blood, or the oxygen molecules. And so the more diffusion you get, so you can get more oxygenation of the actual blood itself. So more oxygen traveling into the tissues. So this is really kind of reinforcing the mechanical component of breathing or breath work. If you don't know how to breathe correctly, then you're not going to be able to change those shapes in the spine. So here we have all the different vertebrae. So the thoracic vertebrae, so you got 12 thoracic vertebrae, and each thoracic vertebrae has a rib onto it. And so when you inhale, okay, the ribs are going to rotate. When you exhale, they're going to rotate. So on the inhalation, the ribs will externally rotate. Okay, on inhalation, they'll internally rotate. So external rotation of ribs creates that more space. And then you have the external intercostal muscles here, which are kind of basically pulling each rib down to create that volume. And then with the diaphragm at the same time pulling it down. So then the space between each individual rib increases. Then as you exhale, the internal intercostals pull the ribs back together. And then the diaphragm is going back up as well. So that action can be passive. So if you just relax the kind of the muscles, they all just return back to the natural shape. So you can see here, these joints here, the costovertebral joints. So sometimes what happens to people is they get very jammed up here. So imagine if you're all sitting at a desk or an office job or also driving, and you get a slight kind of rounded back. These joints don't get a lot of movement. They kind of get stuck, or they get hypomobile. And when they get stuck, that means when you're trying to inhale, because the ribs have to externally rotate, they don't rotate. And so those muscles here, the intercostals, don't get activated. So they don't really develop that strength to kind of spread and draw the rib cage back together. So they get stuck. So then we need to kind of like get those mobilized. Now, the best way to actually get these ones mobilized, unless they're super stuck, you might need some manual therapy, some osteo, some chiro, some acupuncture can be really helpful just to kind of get in there and free up those joints. Is specific breathing exercises where you're focusing on putting the spine in different positions, which is going to kind of facilitate or help encourage those muscles to start to work. So it takes a little bit of conscious effort, but it's certainly doable, very achievable. So here we have all these little rotatory muscles that thread upward, right up and down the spine. And so you can see here, they go from the transverse process to the spinous process here. So well, this would be thoracic vertebrae number 1. This would be thoracic vertebrae number 2 here. So thoracic vertebrae 2 from the transverse process goes to the spinous process of thoracic vertebrae number 1. So the spinous process is the big kind of shark fin that's sit at the back, whereas the transverse process is these ones that sit out to the side. And so individually, those little muscles, they contract to help rotate the individual thoracic vertebrae. So part of our training is that we're slowly developing rotation of the spine with breathing. So when you inhale, because there's that natural external rotation, all right, those muscles are going to help to create that external rotation by moving the vertebrae. So the ankle bone connected to the knee bone, rib bone connected to the thoracic vertebrae. So if you move the thoracic vertebrae, you're going to move the rib. Okay, they're kind of reciprocal. So what you would do is you would inhale, and then you would either exhale to one side or exhale with some rotation, just really gently, and that's going to help start to facilitate these movements, but you need to do it in the correct way. So inhale creates extension. So if we come back to here, when we're trying to get the ribs up, what's going to happen there is that the spine's going to kind of go into extension. So it's going to straighten. Or if you think of your crown of your head going towards the roof, so as you breathe in, you create lengthening through the spine, extension. And at the same time on the front, the diaphragm is being pulled down inferiorly, and the abdominal wall here on the front is holding the ribs in position. Okay, otherwise you just kind of dump all the way back and your ribs flare up, and that creates a secondary problem, which we can talk about in another video. So inhalation is always like a lengthening or extension of the spine to create more space in this thoracic cavity to get more air into the lungs. Okay, if you are in a slouch position and you breathe in, you just can't get a very big breath. You certainly can still breathe in, but you just can't get a full breath in. Okay, but when you breathe in and you straighten up, that facilitates this kind of lifting of the chest. So the chest up, sternum up through here. So this is the mandible here. Go back a little bit. So that's the sternum, that's the xiphoid process. This is the mandible where the clavicles attach. So you can feel that just below you, kind of your sternal notch here, that bone there. So when you breathe in, if you think about that bone lifting up and forward, so up and forward, okay, that'll elevate that part of the chest for you. And at the same time, when you breathe in, you want to think about the side ribs here going outward. So up and forward, bottom ribs outward, okay, and then you'll start to get that 360-degree expansion of the ribs. Okay. And then what you can do is then you can just intentionally, you can think, I'm going to breathe into my armpit here. So you're going to specifically focus your mind into this area, and you're going to breathe into there, and you'll feel like if I breathe into my right armpit, see my right shoulder lifts up. And then if I keep that up there and I breathe out to my left, so I sink my left shoulder down, I'm going to side bend into the left. Now, if I come back, breathe in, straighten up. So my left shoulder lifted up. Now exhale right down. And so you use your breathing to kind of guide the movement in and out. It's really, really important. So when we do breath-centered yoga asana work, when we do qigong practice, when I teach Pilates, all my training is orientated around breath-centered movement. So I'm always cueing people when to inhale, when to exhale, when to inhale, when to exhale. Now the body's really, really adaptable, and it can reverse the breathing. And there's some more advanced techniques, particularly in the martial arts, in qigong and in yoga, where we do reverse abdominal breathing. And there's some really, really good benefits for that. But if you kind of get it backwards, you're not really sure what you're doing, you can kind of create these biomechanical problems in the spine, where you lock out the spine, and then you're creating these really stiff spines that don't work very well. So you've got to learn the foundations first before you do the advanced training in kind of breath work. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of people who kind of get into trouble. They get kind of hypoventilation. They can't get enough air in because they're either flaring their ribs and they're stuck in extension, or they're kind of in a round posture and don't know how to hold that position and get out of it again. Or they don't know how to breathe in and out whilst using their core muscles. It's quite complicated. It's quite complex. So it's just thinking about what the actual purpose of breathing is. The key fundamental role of breathing is to get air into the lungs for oxygen to get into the system, because all our cells, every cell needs oxygen to create energy in the cell. So no oxygen, no energy, cells don't work. Doesn't matter where it is in the body. It's the universal principle. So if you know how to breathe correctly, in Tai Chi and Chinese medicine, we say you solve 1,000 problems, because getting an adequate oxygenation and diffusion to the tissues and what's called internal and external respiration. Okay. If you can make that really efficient and really synergistic, you will solve 1,000 problems. So instead of trying to fix, for example, fatigue, fatigue is probably the simplest one. Fatigue can be simply because you're not getting enough oxygen to the tissues, and they're not diffusing into the tissues from the blood correctly. And so that could be because you're not breathing in and out, you're not getting enough volume of air in and out of the lungs. You might be over exhaling, so you're breathing out too much carbon dioxide, which will then make you more alkaline in the body. And more alkaline means that you're going to be dropping alkaline in the blood, so your pH will go up in the blood. And then that basically then means that you're not going to be releasing oxygen from the cell to diffuse into the cell from the blood. And that's a big problem, and that can create fatigue in people. So chronic fatigue that's a big component of chronic fatigue, is the respiratory component. The other part is a lot of environmental stuff. There's toxins, there's mold. Chronic fatigue is quite complicated, but breathing is one of the really important strategies in helping someone recover from chronic fatigue syndrome. So when we're doing mechanical respiration, we need to consider these things. So if you look here, we have this kyphosis posture. So this is this rounded posture, kyphotic. So all those ribs are then internally rotated. You can see here that the ribs here are depressed down. Okay, so what that means here, if you're in a slouch of a kyphosis too much, you're not going to be able to get this diaphragm to pull down, to contract. So you're not going to be able to draw enough air into the lungs. So the compensating mechanism that the body will use for that is to over-recruit the upper traps and elevate the shoulders, use the sternocleidomastoid, use the scalenes to lift up those top few ribs. And so you become a neck and shoulder breather. And that's a real problem because then you're going to compromise the neck a lot. You're going to impinge a lot of structures through here. It's typically a stress posture. It's a stress breathing position. So your nervous system is going to be more sympathetically orientated. And so you're going to be more anxious, more kind of a little bit on edge, not going to be able to fully relax, fully engage. And then biomechanically, you're stuck in this kind of flexion kind of posture, which means then you can't rotate. Okay, because when you ribs are internally rotated, the vertebrae are also in flexion. They're in the closed position, which means when you close the vertebrae down, then they're very locked down and they don't have a lot of freedom to move. So then if you're trying to do rotation or twisting movements, you're going to get jammed up. And that's either going to strain the joints in the back, or you're going to have to create excessive movement in the neck, in the lower back, or even in the hip to compensate for that lack of movement through the thorax. So posture absolutely matters in breathing and in movement. And people who say that posture doesn't matter, they're allowed to have their opinions, of course, but I disagree. Okay, so quick review. Okay, so breathing is about getting air into the lungs. Okay, the way air gets into the lung is through pressure gradient changes. Okay, because the atmosphere on the external part of the body is greater than internal part of the body. Okay, gas move from high pressure to low pressure. So when we breathe in, we change the volume or the shape of the rib cage. Okay, and it decreases the pressure in the lungs. So the air moves from the high pressure into the low pressure. So it gets sucked in like a vacuum. Okay. When you breathe out, yeah, it decreases the volume in the lungs, which increases the pressure, which then pushes air out of the lungs. So that's one of the key principles of changing the pressure gradient when you're breathing. You do that with your breathing muscles, being the diaphragm is the key one, the intercostals, and particularly the abdominals. If you're really trying to get full exhalations, you need to recruit the abdominals to pull the ribs down and to push that diaphragm back up, to push the air out. So the breathing can become passive, where it's just as you exhale, you just relax, and there's a big tendon on the diaphragm, which will basically acts like a spring and it just pulls back as you exhale. And also the elasticity of the lungs. The lungs themselves have got like this kind of elastic kind of component to it. So when they breathe in, they stretch. When you exhale, they kind of recoil back. So there's this natural kind of elasticity part of the lungs. And some conditions like COPD, they lose that elasticity in the lungs. And so the air sacs get filled up with air, but then they don't deflate. So the air gets trapped in the actual alveoli. And that becomes a problem because you breathe in, but then you can't breathe out. And so you get these big barrel chests. So actually then one of the things we do then is help people, teach them how to mechanically exhale, pull those ribs down to actually then squish, if you will, the alveoli to help push the air out. So mechanical breathing is really, really helpful. Then that affects the spine because of all the vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae connected to the ribs. Okay, we have the costovertebral joints. If they get stiff or locked up, then the ribs themselves aren't going to rotate internally and externally. So then you're not going to be able to get the full breath in, full breath out. That becomes an issue. And then that leads to postural changes. So like a kyphosis here. And when you have a kyphosis or a rounded upper back, then you have a weakness or a imbalance in the muscular system. Diaphragm is placed in a position where it can't contract fully, so you can't get a full breath in. That tends to lead people to over-recruit their upper traps, scalenes, sternocleidomastoid, which then creates neck and shoulder issues. And then to get more range of movement. If you're doing any rotation or twisting, then the rotation and twist has to come through the lower back and the hips or through the neck, which creates problems there as well. So biomechanically, learning how to breathe correctly, when you place breathing into movement, it makes all the movement just work a lot better. And so if you change your mindset from training and pushing, you'll learn the movement patterns and you learn how to breathe in and out correctly with the movement patterns. And then you learn how to breathe in and out correctly with the movement patterns while you're bracing and stabilizing with your abdominal musculature. You have a really strong, stable base. Joints move properly. Everything's kind of synergized. All the reaction forces are kind of neutralized. And then you have freedom of movement, which is pretty amazing to feel. All right. So thank you very much, guys. Hope you enjoyed that one. So looking at kind of changing the thoracic volume. We are using the Muscles in Motion app. So if I just minimize this, we're in the yoga version. We're looking at asana, and we're in core asana. We're in the theory section, so you'll be able to find the video here. So we've got heaps of other videos. This is one we're looking at here, effects of vertebral rotation on respiratory function. Okay, so definitely check out the app. Go and get a subscription for it. Plenty of stuff here you can dig into that we haven't gone covered yet. So go and support the guys on the app. That's amazing. To help support me, if you could just do two things, that'd be great. So like and share, of course, subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any questions at all, whack them down in the comment section. Always happy to answer questions where I can. All right. Wherever you are, have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video.